question. We had a session last weekend on racial justice communications, and a number of the people in the room were doing work on immigration. And I feel like if I just take out a few of the words that you're saying, the same set of circumstances in terms of the implications of detention centers on what is happening to Latinos and in this country, they could sit on top of each other and look the same. And so how are we thinking about this, not just the systems as separate things, but the systems collectively, and going into or shifting the frame of this in a different way? Because for what they're doing to whole families, you know, we talk about what's happening as individuals in the detention, but when you look at Hutto, is that in Texas? Hutto in Texas, they are putting whole families into detention, whole families, and where children are growing up, where children haven't done anything. They are the child of, and so what is the relationship to this across the system of our families and the implications for that, and how we talk about policy and address policy from a different space? And so,
and I just wanted to hear a little bit about prisoners and work, low wage work in prisons. What's happening there?
I mean, that's not my expertise, but certainly that privatization issue of using prison. You're talking about slave labor. It's really the new slave labor, and it's definitely something we have to work against.
Can't find jobs outside of prison, but inside prison,
yeah.
We'll make sure.
Right.
I'll just say the 13th Amendment, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except as punishment for a crime. Many people don't realize the prison slavery clause in the 13th Amendment, which basically codifies slave labor in prisons. And it actually, if you look at it, you know, what you see when you talk about the prison industrial complex, you know, and like corporations love prisons. Yeah. They love prisons because they can get that labor
really,
very, very cheap. Okay.
Really the last one. Go to the next section. Go ahead, Maya.
Well, so a question I think Carl asked about economic opportunity, and I think that in much of this, the silent discourse is the economic discourse as we've moved throughout the panels, and I just wonder if there's a way for us to talk explicitly about that, because it's a huge driver, right? And as I go back to my younger days Marxism, and I think, well, you know, surplus populations are kind of part of what makes capitalism work, and so here we are. And I think that really not having that analysis of what is the economic function of having these large swaths of population bracketed, both socially, politically, and economically, like what work does that do for the way the system works? And I don't think that we have been as crisp and astute about really tackling that and navigating and moving that.
I think that's absolutely right. In fact, Kitty and I were whispering a little bit during the session when Carl raised a question, because I think one, and I wrote this down, one question I think we really have to lay out, and I know this is a lot of what my own writing and work is on, is this question of we are in a post-job global economy, but yet almost all of the way that we've been talking about how people get income in this conversation too has been about jobs, right? And even though we don't, there's really not enough jobs, and even you know, the way the economy is currently constructed, and 2/3 of the world does not have access to wages in any kind of real way, and that percentage is coming home here to the U.S. So I think one of the questions for us really is, what does it look like, you know, for people to be able to survive, and do we have to assume that they have to have a job? Now, we're not talking about work. right? We're talking about jobs, right? Work is different, right? So part of what we have to, and I think the fundamental challenge is because government is a place where we pool our resources to take care of needs, is how does government have to be restructured and reimagined to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met, you know, outside of the structure of providing jobs, which is, again, different than work, right? And so I think for that is a fundamental question and something that I hope we'll get to wrestle with more in the context of this, and definitely most of tomorrow morning, thinking about this reimagining of government to meet basic needs, because the running trend through everything we're talking about is, you know, the levels of which we have the way capital formation and the monetization of things, you know, means people are trying to find capital to survive, which in a way that they shouldn't have to.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Stop. No, it's totally fine. No, I just want to move us from this conversation into the beauty and aesthetic. I also want to just do a little shameless plug and say that a lot of the thinking that my outfit has been doing actually addresses some of these questions, but from the realm of the aesthetic, from like trying to play with some of these ideas as through the lens of design and art. And so a lot of artists and a lot of designers are trying to tackle these questions around how can you be a viable, functioning, living subject in the era of post-work. And so we have this thing called Life Lab, and we're trying to think about that. And we would have talked about that in this section, but instead, I'm going to ask Mimi to give you guys a couple of questions. If you want to talk to me about Life Lab at some point, I'm around. And
yes.
Thank you. Good job. And what I want you to do is, instead of the normal small group sitting in here, have a good conversation. I'm going to ask people to get the coats and go outside or walk around or something and sort of get some outside air and think about the questions that Mimi will ask us to think about.
Well, I've gotten this job very quickly, but I will do my best. But one of the things I think tying in with what we just talked about is, and if you think about the stereotype of African American men, brings us to, you know, how do you move policymakers to change the kind of, bring about the change we've talked about. And of course, Makani is the godmother of all of this, but I think we have to work to change the frames. We have to work so that there is a different frame of African American men, of African American communities, other communities. And so that might be some way to think, you know, how do we do that? Because we have to have organized people who have a different perspective so that politicians have the political will and the support to make these kinds of changes that we're talking about. You know, right now people are afraid of African American men, and as a politician you can't make some of these decisions that you might know are right for fear that you will not get reelected. So we have to build that up. So what is the role of telling stories? What's the role of telling stories from communities who are not typically storytellers, and how can arts and culture be involved in bringing those to the fore? And then I guess the other thing is looking at art, culture, heritage as a part of asset mapping and asset building in community development. A lot of our communities, those are the things we really have, our cultural heritage, our history, our music, our stories, our dance. And there are models around the country of communities that are using those as the real asset to build better economies, sustainable economies. So maybe that would be another one. How can we tie that into some of the things we talked about?
Right.